Steam locomotives in miniature at the Steam Workshop. This one's called Various Jobs and Another Look at the Duke of Gloucester. Working on the bench next to me is a young man called Billy Stock, and what he's doing is fitting a hand pump to the Chubb locomotive that I rebuilt a while back. And he's mounting this hand pump on its side, and at first I wasn't sure whether this was going to work properly, because on pumps of this type, the stainless steel balls in the valve chamber seat on the holes using gravity. But Billy tested the pump on its side in the sink upstairs, and he said that it worked fine on its side. On screen at the moment is a photograph of the Garrett DCC traction engine, or as it's more commonly known, a Garrett 4CD tractor, and this is turning out to be quite a difficult job. The person who dismantled it never took any photographs, so I've got very little to work on, and it's a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. Last week, out of the blue, Simon dropped the bombshell. He said, "By the way, the wheels were very loose when I first tested this traction engine and they wobbled about." Nice timing, Simon. It was really good of you to let me know at this late stage that I had to dismantle the engine once again to fix the axle and the axle boxes. But my patience is fairly infinite, and it's just another day at the Steam Workshop. So I removed the entire back part of the engine, and then I took out the axle box assembly, and this really did take some doing. The person who dismantled it in the first place didn't take it as far as this, and when Dave painted it, he painted it in situ. And I'm not surprised, because there was only one possible way that this assembly would come out from between the frames. I figured it out after a while, and it drove me mad. But now you see the part in a bath of cellulose thinners, and I'm using a brush to remove the paint. This part is quite well made. The traction engine is generally good, but in certain areas some of the parts are not too good, and in other areas they're very good indeed. So what needs to be done? The bearings have been worn oval by the weight of the traction engine on the axle over a period of time. We had a bit of a meeting and looked at the components. I suggested a way of fixing it using an expanding reamer to increase the diameter of the gunmetal bearings and then put a sleeve on the axle. But that idea was dismissed by the powers that be, so I dismantled the engine without complaining, and after I've cleaned up the parts, I'm going to give them to Graham, who's the machinist at the Steam Workshop, to make new bearings and machine down the axle to fit. And while I was doing all that, Billy, on the bench next to me, finally fitted the hand pump to the side of the Chubb locomotive. It's quite tight fitting this axle pump in this position, and Billy's had to make a right-angled union for the top, and he's going to have to make a right-angled union for the bottom. And finally, when he refits the footstep in place, that covers the pump, so it doesn't really look out of place. And I suppose it does look better in this position than it did in the cab. Once Billy's made the lower right-angled union, he can then pipe it into the same feed as the axle pump. In this clip, I'm taking off the masking tape that covers the bearing surface of the front axle. Last week, when Simon told me about the rear axle, he also mentioned that the front axle was also a very sloppy fit on the front wheels. So before I do any more reassembly, I'm going to check this out. The masking tape is firmly stuck to the axle because it's been on there for a couple of months. And finally, the last piece comes off. Initially, it was quite difficult to fit the axle into the wheels for two reasons. One is each end of the axle is a different diameter, and the other reason being the hole in the wheel is full of paint overspray. And Simon was of course correct. The axles were a rattle fit in the holes in the wheels. So these parts were also put in the area of the workshop where Graham the machinist works. And Graham will make new bearings for the wheels and true up the axle. Now for some proper engineering. This is the Duke of Gloucester, which is a 7 1/4 inch gauge Pacific locomotive. That means it has a 462 wheel arrangement, and at the moment it's sat on a stand with the boiler roughly in place. This is just a loose test fit to make sure that the boiler fits into the smoke box and everything fits on the frames, and indeed it does. This engine uses Caprotti valve gear, as I mentioned in the last video, and it's absolutely beautifully made. This is the dome cover that fits on top of the boiler. I don't know who made this, whether it was John or Graham, but once again the engineering standard of this small yet significant part is very good indeed. The boiler wasn't made in-house, but whoever made it really knew how to do this sort of thing. This is boiler smithing taken to the next level. And look at the size of that firebox, it's immense. This boiler will steam beautifully. It's now late afternoon on the same day that I dismantled this engine, so I thought I would take this opportunity to paint the crank webs. So I've degreased them and I'm rubbing them down with some Scotch-Brite. John handed me a small pot of red paint, and using my very small paintbrush, I got on with the job. And this is a tricky job. I do not want to get any paint anywhere else on the engine other than on the crankwebs. And believe me, that's easier said than done. These crankwebs and the connecting rods are very close together, but with a bit of care and attention to detail, it's not going to be a problem. But unfortunately, it's one of those days, and there was a problem. The pot of paint that John gave me to paint the crankwebs is old paint, and I watched him stirring it, and I thought, that looks like a bit of a problem, like it's skinned over. So the resultant paint had lots of blobs in it, and it's no good at all. It's just going to look horrendous. It's very important that the paint looks good on these crankwebs, and that's no good at all, so I removed it. And while I was doing that, Billy has made a right-angled fitting for the bottom end of the hand pump. And in this clip is attempting to fit the fitting to the bottom of the hand pump, which is quite fiddly, but he does get there in the end. Here's a close-up of the hand pump with the modified fittings. The fittings still need a bit of cleaning up and polishing, but it's okay for the moment, and here's a test fit of the pump in place. The fitting at the bottom of the pump, the one to the left, is the water inlet, and I suggested that he didn't take the water from the main water tank because there isn't much capacity in the tanks on the locomotive. I suggested that he piped up the hand pump to take water from the external tank on the riding truck, and I think that's probably what he was going to do. At this point, I went home for some tea, and then later on in the evening, Billy sent me this. Apparently there was a problem when Billy tried to silver solder a T-piece to the feed pipe so that the hand pump could share the feed to the check valve with the axle pump, which unfortunately was soft soldered and fell apart. It's just been one of those days at the steam workshop. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful.